She said it on a Saturday morning while I was down on one knee on the pine boards, hammer in hand, sweat already soaking through my shirt. She was leaning against the new railing, the last post I had driven flush the day before, holding that dark ceramic mug with the orc motifs along the rim, looking down at me with a quiet smile. "I wish you were my husband." I didn't answer right away. I looked up. Morning light was pouring gold through her dark hair, catching the green of her skin in a way that made it look less like color and more like the surface of a deep, still pond. Something in my chest went very still. I had known Ghara long enough by then to know the difference between a joke and a door left slightly open, between the easy laughter of a neighbor and the careful placement of a sentence designed to see what happens when it lands. That was not a joke. "My name is Rowan Hale. 43 years old, I do residential carpentry out of Elmfield, a border settlement that exists because two species needed somewhere to trade and somebody had to build the buildings they traded in. Nothing glamorous, nothing that earns you a name beyond the town limits. I drive a cart with sawdust in the seat cracks, and a wheel I stopped explaining years ago. I keep my tools organized, my invoices paid on time, and my word when I give it. Most mornings I'm up before dawn, home before dark, and that rhythm has been the shape of my life for a long time now. I love the smell of fresh-cut pine in the morning, that damp, sweet sharpness before the sun fully climbs. I love the sound of a chisel biting clean into solid timber, that brief resistance, and then the give. Most of all, I love the feeling when something crooked and uncertain becomes steady again under your hands. I have always been better at fixing things than talking about them. That is probably the most important thing to understand before I go any further. Petra and I separated 4 years ago. No children, no prolonged war. Just a Tuesday evening when she set her ring on the kitchen counter and said, "I'm not happy, Rowan, and I don't think you are either." She was right on both counts. We had been two people living parallel lives inside the same house, saying the right things at dinner with friends, feeling almost nothing real underneath any of it. The split was clean. No magistrates, no ugly late-night messages sent through mutual friends. We divided what was ours, signed what needed signing, shook hands on the front steps. I mean that literally. We shook hands and went our separate ways. SOS, hey STASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTASTA still think of Petra without anger. That is the truest thing I know how to say about my marriage. It ended without anger, and somehow that was the saddest part of all. I bought the house on Sycamore Lane the following spring. Single story, white siding, wide front porch with a ceiling beam someone had notched at a slight angle, so the rain gutter dripped unevenly on the west side. I never fixed it. It would take 20 minutes, and I liked having something left to do. The kind of street where neighbors wave from their yards before the first cup of morning tea is finished. Humans mostly. A few orc families at the far end where the street curves toward the northern road. A border settlement where the two species had learned to coexist, the way furniture learns to share a room, not through enthusiasm, but through the gradual acceptance that moving was more trouble than staying. A small life. I told myself I was fine with it. Enough mornings in a row that it started to ring true, the way repeated things eventually do, whether they actually are or not. My neighbor to the left was Ghara. Everyone in Elmfield called her Ghara, though I learned later that her full orc name was longer, with syllables that required a different relationship between tongue and palate than human mouths were built for. She was 49 years old, orc, widowed, 3 years before I moved in. Her husband, Dral, had been an orc, a former border guard, one of the men who walked the treaty line between territories and made sure the peace held in the specific unglamorous way that peace is actually maintained, not through diplomacy, but through presence. He had died suddenly. The heart, the healer said. The orc word translated roughly to, the engine stops, which Ghara told me once was more accurate than anything human medicine had offered. No warning, no gradual decline, no chance for a last word. She had kissed him goodbye before her shift at the settlement healing house, and come home that evening to a neighbor sitting on her front steps, waiting to tell her. Dro had chosen to live in the human settlement. Between two worlds is nowhere, he had told her. Better to choose one and make it yours. They had chosen Elmfield, built a house together, half human carpentry, half orc stonemasonry, the way they had built everything, with techniques from both traditions that didn't always fit, but somehow held. Then Dral died. Ghara stayed, because this was their home, and leaving it would have been leaving the last place his hands had touched. She shared this one late September evening, both of us leaning on the fence line between our yards. Her voice was level in the particular way of someone who has either made peace with a thing or carried it so long it no longer shows. I did not ask which. There are things you sense a person has earned the right to hold privately. The first thing I noticed about Ghara was the mug. Not Ghara herself. I noticed her immediately, of course. She was orc, which in Elmfield was not unusual, but was not invisible either. Tall, broad-shouldered, with deep green skin and dark hair, she kept pulled back from a face that was strong-boned and quiet. She moved through the human settlement with the careful, measured presence of someone who had spent years learning to take up the right amount of space. Not less than she deserved, but not more than the room expected. But the mug was the thing I kept coming back to. It was orc-made, dark ceramic heavier than human pottery, with a pattern along the rim that I would later learn was a mourning design. Orc widows drank a specific bitter herb tea every morning from a vessel marked with their dead partner's clan symbols. You drank it until the mourning was done. When the mourning was done, when you decided it was done, because only the widow could decide, you stopped. Ghara had been drinking from it for 3 years. Every morning, she stood on her porch with both hands wrapped around that dark mug, looking at her garden. The tomato cages, human style, and the raised beds of orc herbs, dark-leafed, thick-rooted, the kind that human soil wasn't naturally suited for but that Ghara had coaxed into growing through stubbornness and knowledge. The bird feeder she kept stocked with seeds that attracted both the small brown human territory finches and the larger blue-black birds that came down from the orc hills in autumn. She would stand in the middle of all of it, very still, holding the mug like it was the one fixed point she was navigating from. 10 minutes, sometimes longer, before she went back inside. I would pretend to check the gutter so I wasn't caught staring. I told myself I was getting a feel for the neighborhood. I understand now why I kept looking. I just wasn't ready to let myself understand it yet. The first step she asked me to fix was in April, a few weeks after the wildflowers along her front walk had opened up in colors that had no business being that vivid. She came to my door on a Wednesday evening, still in the healer's tunic she wore at the settlement healing house, where she had worked for going on 15 years. Orc medicine and human medicine didn't overlap perfectly, but Ghara had learned both, and the settlement had quietly come to depend on her the way it depended on the well and the grain store. Essentially, without acknowledgement. She had the mug with her. She always had the mug. She smiled when I opened the door, the kind of smile that belongs to a person who has spent years handling everything alone and is choosing, just this once, to ask. "Rowan, I know you're probably tired," she said, "but my front step has been making this awful creaking every time I come home, and I'm honestly afraid it's going to give out one of these mornings." Then she waited, not nervously, just patiently, the way she did almost everything, without pushing, without filling the space she had opened up. I grabbed my tool bag and went right over. Loose stringer bracket, a couple of pegs working their way free through 2 winters of freeze and thaw, the kind of problem that sounds alarming and fixes in 20 minutes. But the fix wasn't straightforward. The step had been built with a combination of techniques. The stringer was human-style mortise and tenon, but the treads were attached with orc dovetail joints, the kind that used no nails or pegs at all, relying instead on the precision of the cut and the weight of the wood to hold. Dro's work, I recognized the technique from a few border-built houses I'd repaired over the years, but I'd never done it myself. I had to think about it, figure out how the joint system worked before I could tighten it without damaging the dovetail. It took me 40 minutes instead of 20, And at the end of it, I had learned something new. Learned it from a dead man's carpentry, taught by the wood itself. When I packed up, Ghara came out with 2 cups of orc tea, bitter, strong, darker than anything my kettle had ever produced. She apologized that she didn't have human tea, and I said it was fine, and we sat on the bottom step together while the sun finished dropping behind the tree line. I don't remember precisely what we talked about. I remember she laughed twice. Not politely, but genuinely, the kind of laugh that surprises the person doing it and makes them look away for just a second. I remember thinking, walking back across the yard, that I had not had a conversation that unguarded in a very long time. Small things you notice when something is beginning, even when you have no idea yet that anything is. Then there was the back fence in May. 3 boards had gone soft over a wet winter and were pulling away from the post. She texted, a note left on the fence post actually, because Ghara preferred paper to the message runners that the settlement used. Don't feel any obligation, but if you have an hour sometime this week. I was there in 30 minutes. She brought the mug out to the backyard and sat in the old canvas chair and watched me work. And we talked the entire time about the deer getting into her garden again. The book she was reading about orc herbal traditions that she said was half right and fully confident, whether the oak at the back corner would ever shed enough shade for the hostess to fill in the way she wanted. The smell of damp earth and split wood, and the trace of whatever bitter herb was in her tea layered into something pleasant and unhurried that I didn't think to name. I just knew the morning felt good. I left with sawdust on my arms, and something quiet settled in my chest, and I did not examine it any closer than that. Then, the kitchen cabinet in June, a lower door swinging at a tilt because the hinge had worked loose from its mounting. She came to the fence. Not a note this time. She just appeared, already laughing at herself before she finished the sentence. I tried to fix it myself, she said. I made it considerably worse. I laughed out loud. Something about the way she said it, the lack of embarrassment, the honest amusement at her own failure, caught me off guard. 20 minutes, I said. She had orc tea ready when I arrived, 2 sugars and a splash of something that cut the bitterness, without asking, because by June she already knew how I took it. She had noticed without making any production of noticing, which I would only recognize later as something she did quietly about most things she cared about. But the cabinet wasn't a simple fix. The hinge was human-made, but it was mounted into an orc-style frame, the heavy, dense wood that orc builders preferred, joined without nails in a system that I was beginning to recognize as Dral's signature, the same dovetail technique I'd encountered on the step. I lay on the kitchen floor looking up at the underside of the cabinet and understanding that every repair in this house was going to teach me something about the man who had built it. Every stripped hinge and loose joint was a conversation with a dead orc I had never met, conducted through the language of wood and the choices he'd made about how things should fit together. Dral didn't know wood the way you do, Gartha said, standing at the counter with the mug in both hands, watching me work. He was a stone man. Orc tradition. Everything is stone and iron. But when we built this house together, he learned carpentry, and he did it the orc way. She smiled. Not the sad kind, the warm kind, the kind that reaches backward towards something it genuinely loved. He used to say nails were the lazy way. A joint should hold because it fits, not because you hammered it into submission. I turned back to the cabinet. My hands slowed without my deciding they should. I let them stay slow. Something about working on a dead man's joinery while his widow watched. Something about the care of it, the intimacy of touching what his hands had made, required a pace that was not about efficiency. Every time she asked, I went immediately, no hesitation, no second thought. I carried my tool bag across the yard and fixed whatever needed fixing. And we sat on the porch afterward and talked until the light shifted. Then I walked home and told myself every single time that this was simply who I was. A carpenter, a neighbor who helped when asked. That was the entire explanation, and I was very comfortable with it. I was lying to myself. I had become extremely fluent at it. One thing I noticed that no one had planted. Along the fence line between our yards, the gardens had begun to cross over. Ghara's orc herbs, dark-leafed, thick-stemmed, the kind that smelled medicinal and grew with the particular stubbornness of plants that had evolved in harsher soil, had spread under the fence into my side. My lavender had crept the other direction, pushing pale roots into her territory. Neither of us had planned it. The plants had simply grown toward whatever the soil offered, without regard for the fence, without awareness that the property line existed. "They've crossed over," Ghara said one morning, looking at the tangle of orc herbs and human flowers growing into each other along the fence. "Plants don't care about fences," I said. She looked at the herbs. She looked at me. She smiled in a way that I felt in a place I was not ready to name. There was a morning in early July when I stepped out onto my porch before dawn, and she was already there on her side of the fence, mug in both hands, looking in my direction. When she saw me, she didn't startle or look away. She simply nodded, slow and easy, as if she had already known I'd come out, as if she had been waiting for exactly that, without any urgency about the timing. We talked across the fence for close to 40 minutes about nothing of any real consequence. The deer, the weather, a cart that had been blocking the end of the lane for a week. Small, easy conversation that went nowhere, and somehow left me feeling more settled than any conversation I'd had all week. I went inside after and stood at my kitchen window for a long moment, and thought, I'm looking forward to tomorrow morning. Not because anything needed fixing, not because there was a reason to go over, just because. Then I thought, that is a problem. Then I thought something else, underneath, that I had been keeping in the dark for weeks. She is orc. I am human. What does that mean? What would the settlement say? What would anyone say? I set all of it down, because setting it down was still the easiest available option, and I had gotten very good at choosing the easiest option when it came to this particular subject. I want to be honest about something. I was not oblivious the way people are oblivious in stories, where the listener can see everything clearly and the person in the middle sees nothing. I could feel something shifting. I felt it the way you feel the weather change before the sky confirms it. Not a specific fact, just a different weight in the air. I felt it every morning at the fence, felt it in her kitchen over bitter orc tea that I had somehow stopped finding bitter. Felt it on her porch in the evenings when we sat and watched Sycamore Lane go from gold to dark. I felt it, and I chose, consistently and deliberately, not to look at it directly, because looking at it directly would have required admitting that I was no longer simply a helpful neighbor, and that admission would have required others, that the 4 years I'd spent calling my solitary life sufficient had been mostly something I told myself because I didn't know what else to do with the quiet, that the quiet was not peace, that underneath the steady rhythm of early mornings and honest work and the small, reliable comforts I'd organized my days around, I had been waiting, without letting myself know I was waiting, for something I couldn't name. Ghara, I understand now, had done all of that reckoning long before I did. She had looked at what was developing between us without flinching away from it. She had decided something about it, and she was then simply waiting, with a patience I can only describe as extraordinary. The kind that belongs to someone who has already done the hard work of being honest with herself, to see whether I would find my own way there, on my own terms, in my own time. She was waiting the way she waited every morning, on the porch with the morning mug, patiently, without rushing the ritual, because some things can only end when you're ready to let them. If this story has you, if you can feel the weight of a morning mug and a fence that plants have already crossed, drop your country in the comments and tell us you're here to see part 2 before anyone else. Hit join. And if this moment earned it, a super thanks keeps the story going. Part 2 is where someone from Rowan's past shows up on Sycamore Lane and says exactly the wrong thing at exactly the right moment. And 3 days of silence follow. Trust me, you'll want to hear what happens when the mug comes home. Petra arrived on a Friday afternoon in late July, when the air was thick and still and the heat sat heavy over the whole lane. She needed to pick up a shelf bracket and 3 books she'd been meaning to collect for over a month. Fine, I'd said when she sent word. Come Friday, I hung up and didn't think about it for 2 days. She appeared at 4 in the afternoon. I was in Ghara's yard finishing the very last board on the porch railing. setting it carefully into position, checking the level 1 final time with the small spirit level clipped to my belt, driving the last pegs until the head sat flush and clean. The railing I'd been building all summer, board by board, in the hours after my paying work was done, because Ghara's old railing had gone gray and splintery, and she'd mentioned it once, and I'd shown up the next day with lumber. I heard a cart from the street and looked up over my shoulder, and Petra was standing on the lane with her hands in her coat pockets, looking across the low fence between the yards. She looked at Ghara, who was standing on the porch steps with the morning mug in her hands. Tall, green-skinned, broad-shouldered orc, unmistakably, comprehensively orc. She looked at the mug. She looked at me, crouched in the afternoon sun, with sawdust on my forearms and the hammer lying on the boards beside my knee. She took all of it in over roughly 1 second. Then she smiled in a way I recognized immediately and had not missed. "Well," she said, "isn't this something?" I set the hammer down on the railing I had just finished. Petra opened the gate and walked into Ghara's yard without being invited. Ghara had gone still, not cold, not rigid, but precise. The way she went when she was carefully absorbing something and deciding what to do with it. The particular composure of a healer assessing a situation before committing to a response. Petra stopped a few feet from her and put on a voice I knew very well. Warm on the surface, measured underneath. The voice she used when she was being deliberate about something and did not want that deliberateness to be visible. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said to Ghara, with a smile that almost reached her eyes. "I'm Petra, Rowan's former wife." She gave that a moment to settle. "I just wanted to make sure you knew something about him because I genuinely think it matters. Rowan is a very kind, very generous man. He loves helping people. He gets truly close to the people he helps. It's just how he's built. It's always been who he is." A pause, timed exactly right, especially with the ones who are different, new to him. He finds that interesting, I think. The novelty. She smiled. "I just hate for you to read more into things than is really there. He always means well. He truly does, even when things get complicated." Every word was technically true. I am kind. I do help people. I do get close to the people I spend time with. Every single word pointed accurately at something real and managed to mean something entirely different at the same time, especially with the ones who are different. That was the knife. Not a slur. Petra was too careful for slurs. Just a word different, placed precisely where it would do the most work. A word that contained orc and species and other and novelty and all the quiet assumptions that border settlements ran on without ever saying out loud. I stood up slowly from my crouch beside the railing. I did not say anything yet. I watched Ghara. Ghara looked at Petra for a long, quiet moment. Then she looked at me. Her face did not shift 1 degree in any direction. She looked back at Petra, and then she reached out and set the morning mug down on the railing I had just built. Set it down with deliberate care, the way you set something precious down when you want both hands completely free. Not angry, not embarrassed, just the smooth, practiced stillness I had come to recognize as what she wore when something had reached her deeply enough that she was not going to let anyone see how deep. "Thank you for letting me know," she said. Her voice was so completely level, so unhurried, so entirely empty of anything I could read, that I felt something fall inside my chest. Petra said it was wonderful to meet her, smiled one final time, walked around to my front door. On her way out, she gave me a long, measured look. "Be careful, Rowan," she said. "People talk in small towns. Some things get complicated between species." "Some things are already complicated," I said. But she was already walking to her cart. She didn't hear it, or she heard it and had decided it wasn't worth a response. I stood in the doorway and watched her drive away down Sycamore Lane. Then I walked around to Ghara's front door and knocked. No answer. I stood on the step, the one I had fixed back in April, the one that no longer made any sound under anyone's weight, and listened to the silence on the other side of the door. I knew she was in there. Her cart was in the yard. The kitchen lamp was on. I could smell the bitter herb tea through the gap in the frame. The morning tea, the one she drank every morning for a man who was gone. I waited a moment longer than felt comfortable, longer than any reasonable person would wait before accepting that the silence was the answer. Then I walked back across the yard to my own house. That evening, I sat alone on my own porch for a long time and thought about the way Ghara had set the mug down on the railing, the care of that single motion, the quietness and precision of it. I thought about how I couldn't find a single readable thing anywhere in her expression, and how I wasn't sure whether that meant she was fine or whether it meant she was far from fine and was simply too practiced at composure to let me see which one it was. I thought about Petra's timing, the way she had arrived at exactly that moment, the way she had delivered each word with careful, measured precision, and I thought about the fact that she had not said a single thing that was technically untrue. I am kind. I do help people. I do get close. Every word pointed at something real and managed to mean something else entirely. That was the part I couldn't set aside through the whole long evening. Not a falsehood in what she'd said, but the truth she had taken and turned into something sharp and aimed directly at the one thing between Ghara and me that was still uncertain, still finding its footing, still too new and quiet to withstand that kind of pressure. And especially the ones who are different. That was the part that sat in my stomach like a stone, because Petra had taken the fact of Ghara's species and wrapped it in a word that sounded understanding and felt like a wall, as if what I felt in Ghara's kitchen and on Ghara's porch and at the fence every morning could be explained by novelty, by the curiosity of a human man encountering something exotic and mistaking the encounter for connection. It wasn't novelty. I had known that for weeks. I had just been choosing not to name it. Sandra had always been good at knowing exactly where the undefended places were. Saturday morning I came out at my usual time. The porch next door was empty. No mug on the railing. No figure standing in the early light with both hands wrapped around it. Just the whiteboards I had laid, gleaming quietly in the sun, and the still air of an unoccupied porch. Sunday, the same. 3 mornings. I counted them the way you count days when absence makes itself persistently known, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. The way a particular kind of quiet gets louder the longer it goes on without anyone addressing it. 3 days of making tea alone and carrying it to my own porch and looking across the fence at nothing. 3 days of telling myself she was fine. She was busy. People got busy. I had done nothing wrong. It wasn't significant. It would pass. 3 days of a quiet shaped differently from all the other quiet I had learned to live inside. Because this particular quiet had an outline I recognized clearly. The outline of a person who was no longer there. On the second evening, I walked the lane alone. The route we would have taken on a Friday, past the maple on the corner, past the cat on the fence who observed me with the same magnificent indifference whether I was alone or accompanied. The same houses, the same trees, the same evening settling over the same small settlement. Everything identical, everything wrong. Because the specific quality of a walk is not determined by the route, but by the presence beside you, and the absence of that presence changes the chemistry of the air the way the absence of a single ingredient changes the chemistry of a recipe. Still food, just not the food you wanted. I stopped at the end of the lane and looked back towards Sycamore and the 2 houses, mine and hers, sitting side by side in the dusk. 2 lit windows, 2 separate evenings being spent in rooms that were 30 feet apart and might as well have been on different continents. I thought about Petra's word, different, the way she had placed it in the sentence, the careful, surgical precision of it. I thought about all the conversations I hadn't had with myself, about what it meant that the person I wanted to see every morning was ORC, that her skin was green, and her hands were larger than mine, and her tea was bitter, and her dead husband had built their house with techniques I was still learning. I had not avoided these thoughts out of prejudice. I want to be clear about that. I had avoided them out of the particular cowardice of a man who knows that once he names a thing, the thing becomes real, and real things require decisions, and decisions require courage, and courage was something I had been rationing carefully since a Tuesday evening when Petra had set her ring on the counter and I had discovered that the life I'd been living was made of material that didn't hold. 3 days. I stood at my kitchen counter on the third evening and looked at the morning mug, sitting where I'd left it. Dark ceramic, heavy, orc made. The clan motifs faded at the handle from 3 years of daily contact with the same pair of hands. And beside it, my own cup, human-made, light, half the size. The two of them sitting together on the counter, the way their owners had been sitting together on porches and at fence lines for months, and I looked at them and understood with the particular clarity that arrives only after you've spent 3 days lying to yourself that the lying is finished. I picked it up. On the morning of the 4th day, I stopped pretending I didn't care. The morning mug had been sitting on my kitchen counter since Friday evening. I had carried it back from the railing without consciously deciding to, the way your hands do things your mind hasn't caught up with yet. For 3 days, I had walked around it, past it, set my own cup on the counter beside it each morning. My human cup, small and light, next to her orc mug, dark and heavy, picked mine up and left hers exactly where it was, and not once stopped to ask myself why I hadn't simply returned it over the fence. I was 30 seconds from her door. I had been over there dozens of times. I had walked across that yard with a tool bag on my shoulder and never given it a second thought. None of that was the explanation. I picked the morning mug up on the 4th morning, held it in both hands. I had to use both, because it was orc-sized, heavier than my own cup, the dark ceramic warm from the morning sun coming through the window. The clan motifs along the rim, worn slightly pale at the handle from 3 years of daily use, the comfortable, familiar weight of something that had been held a long time by someone who needed it. I carried it across the yard, stepped up onto the porch I had built, knocked on the door. She opened it. She didn't look surprised to see me standing there. She looked the way a person looks when they have been quietly waiting for a specific thing to happen and feel something ease inside when it finally does. Her eyes went to the mug right away, but she didn't reach for it. I held it out. "Yours," I said, which was unnecessary, she knew. She took it but stayed in the doorway, one hand on the frame, one hand around the mug. I was on the top step, roughly eye level with her. She was taller than me by several inches, orc height, and on level ground I had to look up. But on the step, we were even. And I said what I had come across the yard specifically to say. "I didn't know Petra was going to show up and say any of that," I told her. "And I need you to understand that I have not been coming over here out of habit, or because I like feeling useful, or because being a good neighbor is simply what I do." I stopped, found the rest of it. I come over because I want to, every single time. That is the most honest thing I know how to say to you right now. She looked at me for a long time, not weighing me, not deciding in that moment whether to trust me. I think she had already done all of that on her own, sometime in the days before this. She was looking at me the way you look at something you've been holding a place for, checking to confirm it has arrived. Then she pulled the door open wider and stepped to one side. "Do you want to come in?" she said. I just put the kettle on. I stepped inside. That was the first time I had ever crossed that threshold. We sat at her kitchen table for close to 3 hours. The kitchen was small and warm, with afternoon light coming in low through the window above the sink. Orc tea on the table between us. Bitter, the morning kind. And the sort of quiet in the room that doesn't need filling. She told me about Dral. Not the way a grieving person recounts loss for a new acquaintance, with the sharpest parts smoothed down. The real version. The first year of learning to sleep in a bed that was too large because it had been built for 2 orcs. Finding that cooking for one was absurd for months before it slowly became normal. Waking in the middle of the night and reaching for someone who wasn't there. Reaching across the space where a broad, warm body had been for 20 years. And lying still in the dark until her breathing settled. She told me what had surprised her most, how much she had found herself capable of carrying without breaking, how grief, when you stayed with it, instead of carefully walking around it, could clarify things about a person as much as it diminished them. She told me all of this steadily, without performing composure and without collapsing into its absence, and I sat across the table and did not reach for a single comforting word to make any part of it easier than it actually was. Because easy words would have been an insult to what she was giving me. which was the truth, and truth deserves to be received at its actual weight. She told me something else, too, something that I carry differently from the rest. When Dral died, she said, the settlement sent food, human neighbors mostly, casseroles and bread and the things humans bring when someone is hurting. It was kind, but none of them stayed. She turned the morning mug in her hands. They left the food on the step. They knocked and walked away before I could open the door. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't know how to be in a room with an orc woman's grief. They didn't know what it looked like or what to do with it. So they left bread and went home. She looked up. You don't do that. You come in, you sit down, you stay until the light changes, and you don't try to fix the grief the way you fix a cabinet. You just sit with it. She paused. Do you know how rare that is? No, I said honestly. I just don't know what else to do. That, she said, is exactly why it works. Then she asked, and I told her about Petra. The real version, not the cleaned-up one I offered in polite company. What had actually gone wrong and when. What I had done badly. What I had known for years and refused to name. She listened the way almost no one manages to listen, without steering, without preparing her next sentence while I was still inside mine. When I finished, she sat with what I'd said for a quiet moment before responding. That pause, the simple space before the reply, was exactly right. Before I stood to leave, I asked the question I'd been carrying across the table the whole afternoon. That day on the porch, I said, when you said you wished I were your husband, did you mean any part of that? She looked down at the morning mug, turned it once, slowly in both hands, the way she always did when she was choosing her words with care. I was joking, she said. Then she raised her eyes directly to mine, but not entirely. A pause, and then, quieter. You are human. I am orc. These are facts I have been thinking about. But here is another fact. For 3 years I have been drinking morning tea every morning, and on the mornings when I talk to you across the fence, the tea tastes less bitter. I do not know what that means yet, but I know it is true. I walked home in the late afternoon light and stood in my own kitchen for a while without doing anything particular. The house looked exactly as it always had, and somehow completely different. If you're still here, if you felt the weight of a morning mug set down on a railing, and 3 days of empty porches, and not entirely, then you already know this isn't a story about fixing steps. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Hit join for part 3. And a super thanks keeps the kettle on. Part 3 is where the morning mug goes silent, where a second cup appears on the shelf, and where 2 people on either side of a fence finally stop pretending the fence matters. Everything you've been waiting for arrives quietly, the way real things always do. July eased into August, and we built a new kind of ordinary together without sitting down to discuss it or plan it out. Friday dinners appeared without anyone formally proposing them. One of us would leave a note on the fence post around 5, asking what the other felt like eating, and an hour later, we'd be in one of our kitchens with something warm on the hearth and the whole evening open ahead of us. Unhurried. Sometimes it was her kitchen, and the food was orc, heavy grain stew, dark bread that tasted of earth, and something faintly sour that I had stopped finding strange and started finding essential. Sometimes it was mine, and the food was human. Lighter, milder, the kind of cooking that Ghara navigated with the polite determination of a guest who has decided to enjoy the local cuisine, even if it lacks the structural integrity she was raised on. Your soup is very thin, she said one Friday, with the diplomatic precision of a healer delivering a difficult diagnosis. Your bread is very present, I said. It doesn't just fill your stomach, it announces itself. She laughed. The real kind. The kind I had been collecting like someone who has discovered a sound they didn't know they needed, and is quietly cataloging every instance. Friday became the fixed point of my week, the thing I was always quietly moving toward through the other 6 days, without fully acknowledging that I was doing it. Acknowledging it would have required naming it, and naming it would have required deciding what it meant to look forward to Friday dinner with your orc neighbor the way other people looked forward to. Well, The comparison was available. I chose not to complete it. Not yet. In September, she gave me a mug. She left it on the fence post. One morning, without ceremony, I came out at dawn, and it was there, sitting in the gray light like it had always been there. And I had simply failed to notice. It was not a human mug. It was ORC. Dark ceramic, heavy. The same dense material as her morning mug. The same clan-style craftsmanship, the same weight that required both hands to hold comfortably. But this one was different in one crucial way. It had no morning design, no clan motifs, no death markings, just smooth, dark ceramic, clean. A note underneath in her careful hand. So you have something that's actually yours to drink from when you come over, instead of borrowing my water glasses like you're sitting in a healer's waiting room. I carried it to her kitchen that afternoon and placed it on the shelf beside hers. Her morning mug, dark, heavy, marked with Dral's clan patterns, and my mug, dark, heavy, unmarked. Side by side, she watched me set it there, did not say a word about it, did not move it then or afterward. The mug was orc-sized. I held it with both hands. I did not mention this. I did not find it strange. I had stopped finding orc-sized things strange. Approximately the same week I had stopped finding the bitter tea bitter, which was approximately the same week I had stopped pretending that what brought me across the yard every morning was neighborliness. October came in cool and amber bright. The sycamores along the lane turning a gold that always managed to look slightly excessive and absolutely necessary at the same time. We started taking walks after Friday dinners. No route planned, no destination, just moving through the settlement, side by side in the early dark, while the air smelled of wood smoke and dry fallen leaves. She was taller than me. This was a fact I was aware of and had stopped measuring. On our walks, her shoulder was above mine, her stride longer, her shadow falling at a different angle. People noticed. Of course they noticed. Elmfield was a small settlement, and a human man walking beside an orc woman after dark was the kind of thing that registered on the particular frequency. Small settlements used for information they hadn't decided how to feel about yet. I knew they were watching. Ghara knew they were watching. Neither of us adjusted our pace. She had a habit of pointing out things most people walked past without noticing. A maple on the corner gone in orange, she described as almost embarrassing. A cat on someone's fence that observed us every Friday with an air of what she called magnificent indifference. The house at the end of the lane whose door wreath, she informed me, had not been replaced in the 11 years she had lived on Sycamore. I started noticing things during the week, specifically to tell her about on those walks. Small things, things I wouldn't otherwise have paused long enough to see. A pattern in the frost on my window. One morning, the way the Smith's chimney smoke bent south before a weather change. A bird that had built a nest in the exact spot where my gutter leaked, as if the leak were a feature rather than a flaw. I told myself it was just keeping up my end of the conversation. I knew by then that it was not just keeping up my end of the conversation. I knew that I was collecting pieces of the world to give to someone, because giving them to her made the world feel like it contained more than it had before I'd started looking. One evening in late October, we stopped at the end of the lane where the road turned toward the Northern Territory. The moon was up, full and heavy, and it lit the fields in the particular silver that made everything look like a memory of itself. Dral and I used to walk this way, Ghara said, not sadly. The way you mention a fact that lives in a place you visit sometimes. Does it bother you? I asked, walking it with someone else. She thought about that. The way she thought about everything, fully, without rushing, giving the question the weight it had asked for. No, she said. The road doesn't belong to the past. It belongs to whoever is on it. She looked at me in the moonlight. And right now, you're on it. I didn't trust my voice to say anything to that, so I said nothing, and we walked back through the dark in a silence that felt warmer than any conversation I'd had all week. In November, on a Friday walk, it happened. The night was cold. The kind of border settlement cold that settled into the bones and stayed there. The kind that made you aware of the exact temperature difference between the air and the person walking beside you. We were on the stretch of lane past the grain store where the lanterns were far apart, and the dark pressed close, and our breath came out in twin clouds that mingled and dissolved. Without looking at me, Ghara reached across and took my hand. No announcement, no pause to check my reaction first, just her hand finding mine in the dark. Green hand, larger than mine, warmer than mine. The fingers closing around my own with the steady certainty of someone who has thought about this for a long time and has decided that thinking is finished and doing has arrived. I did not look at her. She did not look at me. We walked that way through the dark, and I remember very little about the rest of the lane, because I was entirely occupied with something else. What I felt was not the fast electric urgency of something new and uncertain. It was slower and deeper than that. The feeling of something solid, something you trust your full weight against without worrying it will move. Her hand was larger than mine. Her grip was stronger, and I did not find either of those things anything other than exactly right. January brought the first real snow, not the thin decorative kind that melts before noon, but a proper overnight covering that turned Sycamore Lane into something from a quieter, older time. I was out before dawn with the shovel, clearing both paths, mine and hers, the way I had been doing since early December without being asked about it or giving it a second thought. Some things you do because they need doing, and some things you do because the person you're doing them for has become indistinguishable from the need itself. When I finished, I leaned on the handle and caught my breath, and Ghara was standing in her doorway in the heavy orc wool cardigan she wore on cold mornings, holding 2 mugs, both dark ceramic, both orc-sized. She tilted her head toward the porch steps. I left the shovel standing in the snow and climbed up. We sat on the top step together with the cold pressing in from all sides and drank our tea, her morning blend bitter and dark, and mine, the same blend without the morning herbs, which she had started brewing separately for me sometime in December, without comment, her shoulder warm against mine, not talking, not needing to, the steam from both mugs rising in the same slow curl in the still morning air. That was one of the most complete mornings I have ever had the good fortune to sit inside of. In March, on a Friday evening after dinner, she looked up from across the kitchen table without any preamble. "Are you happy, Rowan?" I sat with that before I answered, because Ghara never asked a real question, and then accepted the comfortable version of the answer in place of the true one. She waited. She was very good at waiting. The patience of a healer, the patience of a widow, the patience of a woman who had learned that the right answer arrives on its own schedule, and rushing it produces nothing worth having. "Yeah," I said finally. For the first time in a genuinely long time, actually, yes. She looked at me for a moment with something in her face I didn't quite have a name for. Then she nodded and looked back down at her tea and didn't add anything more. She had asked because she wanted the true answer. She had gotten it. That was enough. Then came the morning. That changed everything. It was April. 1 full year since the first creaking step. A year of small repairs and Friday dinners and morning fence conversations, and the slow, patient construction of something that neither of us had named, but both of us had been building. Board by board, the way I built porches, carefully, in the correct order, checking each piece before moving to the next. I came out onto my porch at dawn. The air was cool and clean the way April mornings are in the borderlands, sharp with the last of winter's departure, and soft with the first of spring's arrival. Ghara was there, on her porch, in the morning light, standing the way she stood every morning, still present, looking at her garden where the orc herbs and the human flowers had tangled so thoroughly along the fence that separating them would have required destroying both. But her hands were different. She was not holding the morning mug. She was holding a different cup, orc-made, dark ceramic, but without the clan motifs, without the death markings, without the 3 years of bitter herb tea that she had drunk every morning for a man she had loved and lost, and carried in that vessel like a lamp she could not set down. I stood on my porch and looked at her hands and understood. The morning was over. Not because the grief was gone. Grief doesn't go. It changes shape. It becomes part of the furniture of a life rather than the structure of it. But the ritual was done. The 3 years of morning tea for Dral, the daily practice of holding his memory in both hands before the day began. Ghara had set it down. She had decided, on her own terms, in her own time, the way the ritual required, because only the widow could decide when the mourning was finished. She looked across the fence at me. I looked at her. Neither of us spoke. The mourning was doing the talking. The light on her green skin, the empty hands that were not empty but holding something different now, something that was not the past. My eyes burned. I didn't try to stop them. Some things you feel, and the feeling is the only honest response available. She raised the new cup, the unmarked one, the one that held nothing but morning tea without the bitterness, and she tilted it slightly toward me. A toast. A beginning. A door opened all the way after a year of being left ajar. I raised my own cup from the railing, the orc-sized one she'd given me in September, the one I held with both hands because that was how it was built and I had stopped noticing. 2 mugs, raised across a fence, in the April light. That same week, she came to my door. "The front step is creaking again," she said. I looked at her. She looked at me. That quiet, steady amusement I had come to know as well as anything else about her. The particular warmth of a woman who has decided to let you see exactly what she is thinking and is trusting you to read it correctly. "Did you loosen it on purpose?" I asked. "The first time," she considered. "Maybe I got my tools." "This time," she said, as I settled onto the step, "you don't need to." I looked up at her from the boards. She was standing above me, tall and green and solid, backlit by the April sun, holding a mug that was not the morning mug in hands that were not morning hands. And the look on her face was the look of a woman who has been waiting, patiently, with extraordinary grace, for a very long time, and who has decided that the waiting is done. I laughed. The real kind, the kind she had been collecting from me the way I'd been collecting hers. Evidence of a sound we'd each forgotten we could make and had taught each other to remember. I packed my tools. She filled both mugs. We went out and sat on the April porch and watched Sycamore Lane go from gold to purple to the first soft dark of a warm spring night. And neither of us needed to say anything at all. Her shoulder against mine, her hand finding my hand in the dark, green and large and warm, closing around mine with the same steadiness she brought to everything, without urgency, without doubt, with the specific certainty of a person who has already done all the difficult work of deciding and is now simply arriving at the place the decision pointed toward. I don't know what love looks like when you're past 40 and you've already failed it once. I don't know what it looks like when the person is orc and you are human, and the settlement has opinions and the fence between your yards has become the most crossed boundary in the whole territory. I didn't know until a woman came to my door with a ceramic mug and a broken step, and I kept showing up without understanding what I was actually there for. Petra said I was kind to my neighbors. She wasn't wrong, but she was wrong about why I kept going back. It wasn't kindness. It was that I didn't want to leave. Kindness is something you extend to other people. What I felt in Ghara's yard, at her kitchen table, on her porch in January cold, that was something I needed just as much as she did, whether I was ready to name it or not. This morning, I sat on Ghara's porch, the one I built board by board over a summer I will not forget as long as I remember anything, and I looked at 2 mugs sitting side by side on the railing, both dark ceramic, both orc-sized, one with faded clan motifs. Hers, the morning mug, retired now, kept on the shelf the way you keep something that mattered too much to use and too much to discard. The other, unmarked, mine, the one she gave me in September, the one I hold with both hands because that is how it was built. The steam rising from both in the same slow curl, in the same light, at the same unhurried pace. Love, when it finds you the second time, does not announce itself. It comes quietly, with a broken step and a cup of bitter tea, and it waits with far more patience than I deserved for you to stop pretending you cannot see it. Is there someone on the other side of your fence right now? And does the fence matter as much as you think it does? The plants crossed over months ago. They didn't ask permission, they just grew toward whatever the soil offered. Maybe that's the whole lesson. Maybe love, the real kind, the kind that survives species and solitude, and the particular cruelty of well-timed truths delivered by people who know exactly where the undefended places are. Maybe it grows the way herbs and flowers grow, under fences, through cracks, toward light. You don't plant it, you just stop pulling it up. If this story stayed with you, if you felt the morning mug went quiet, if you held your breath when the plants crossed the fence, then carry it today. Subscribe to ORC Tears and hit the bell for more stories where love arrives without announcing itself, where a mug on a railing changes everything, and where the fence between 2 yards turns out to be the smallest distance 2 people ever crossed. Tell us in the comments which moment stayed, the creaking step, the morning mug, not entirely, the 3 days of silence, the plants under the fence, the morning she stopped. We read every single one. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. I'll see you in the next one.